She had been eating alone her entire life. Nobody ever looked twice at the round, quiet girl in the corner booth. Nobody, until the night she whispered those 4 words to a man whose answer would detonate every carefully hidden truth about who she really was. Nadia Okafor had a system. It was not a glamorous system, not the kind of life blueprint that gets written about in glossy self-help books or celebrated on morning talk shows. It was simply a quiet, efficient method of surviving in a world that had made it abundantly clear from a very early age that she was not the kind of woman people made room for. She arrived at restaurants early, before the crowds, before the eyes. She chose corner booths specifically because the shadows were deeper there and the walls on 2 sides meant nobody could walk past and make that particular face, the involuntary, brief flicker of mild disgust that she had learned to recognize in the split second before polite neutrality snapped back into place. She wore dark clothing, not because she liked dark clothing, but because she had internalized, somewhere around the age of 14, that less visible meant less vulnerable. She was 29 years old. She was 5 feet 4 inches. She carried 250 pounds on a frame that her mother had once called sturdy, that her college roommate had called big-boned, and that the rest of the world had simply called fat. Nadia called it Tuesday. The restaurant was called Aurelius. It occupied the entire ground floor of a converted Victorian building in the financial district, all exposed brick and amber lighting and imported leather banquettes the color of dark cognac. It was the kind of place that existed to make people feel important, and it succeeded, because every table was occupied by someone who unquestionably was. Nadia had been sent here by her firm. She was a tax attorney at Holloway & Associates, technically a senior associate, functionally the person who untangled whatever impossible forensic knot the junior partners handed her at 11 at night. She was brilliant at it. She had a mind that consumed complex numerical structures the way other people consumed air, without effort, without celebration, simply as the basic function of existing. The firm had sent her here tonight because a client, someone whose name occupied multiple columns of the city's business section, had requested an urgent preliminary consultation before the main meeting tomorrow morning. It was supposed to be 45 minutes. Her contact would meet her at the bar, pass her a preliminary brief, and she would go home to her studio apartment in the East Quarter and spend the rest of the night dissecting it. She had arrived at 7:30. By 8:15, her contact had not appeared. She had finished her sparkling water. She had resisted ordering food because eating alone at a bar in a restaurant like this always felt performative in the worst possible way, as if she were an exhibit in a gallery of human disappointment. By 8:30 she was genuinely hungry, and hunger, when Nadia was already anxious, had a way of stripping her down to something raw and undefended. She looked at the menu. She put the menu down. She looked at it again. She was aware, with the specific hyper-awareness of a woman who had spent her entire life monitoring her own body in public spaces, that the men sitting 2 seats down at the bar had glanced at her twice. She did not look at him directly. She had learned long ago that looking directly at a man who was paying attention to her was an invitation she was not prepared to accept because the acceptance was almost always followed by the particular kind of humiliation that left marks you could not see but could absolutely feel. She would wait 5 more minutes. She would send an apologetic text to the client liaison at her firm. She would leave. The seat beside her was empty when she sat down. By 8:45, it was occupied. She became aware of this not through sight but through heat, the specific radiating warmth of a large body settling into close proximity, and then a scent, cedarwood and something darker beneath it, something that smelled faintly of authority, if authority had a smell. She still did not look. She was very good at not looking. Then the noise of the restaurant shifted, and she noticed, peripherally, that it had not shifted because of ambient sound, it had shifted because a significant number of people in the immediate vicinity had gone quietly, carefully still in the way that prey animals go still when something considerably higher on the food chain enters their radius. She looked up. The man beside her was not looking at her. He was looking at the bar, at his own hands, at the amber liquid in the glass that had appeared in front of him with extraordinary speed, as if the bartender had anticipated the order before it was placed. He was large. Not in the way that most men use the word, not broad in a manufactured gym-cultivated way, but large in the way of something that had simply grown that direction, tall and wide across the shoulders, with the kind of physical presence that suggested his body had never once been asked to justify itself. His suit was charcoal. It was not a suit you bought. It was a suit that was constructed around you by someone who understood the geometry of power. His face was striking in the way that severe landscape features are striking, a jawline that looked as though it had been designed for intimidation, dark skin stretched clean and smooth over angular bone, eyes so dark they absorbed the amber light rather than reflecting it. He was, she realized in the same instant she wished she had not realized it, extraordinarily, almost unreasonably handsome. And then he turned. He looked at her directly, without the social preamble of gradual drift, without pretending he had not already been aware of her. He simply turned his head and looked at her the way men like him never looked at women like her, which was to say he looked at her as if she were the only object in the room worth the precision of his full attention. Nadia did not say anything. Nadia was constitutionally excellent at not saying anything. The seat at the very end of the bar, the last open seat, had just been taken by a group of 3 who were expanding territorially into the adjacent space the way loud confident people always did, and the net result was that there was now a slightly larger gap between her and everyone else in the bar except for this man, and the gap felt somehow charged rather than relieved. She became aware that she was staring at her water glass with the extreme focus of a woman trying to look as if she were definitely not affected by anything, which was the clearest possible signal that she was. She needed to say something, or she needed to leave. She was not going to leave because she was still waiting on the contact who was now 40 minutes late, and she was not the kind of woman who abandoned a professional obligation because she was experiencing an acute and unwelcome case of physical awareness of a stranger. So she said the only thing that made logical sense under the circumstances. She turned her head, and very quietly, in a voice that she kept level through approximately 400 pounds of internal effort, she said, "Can I sit with you?" And then, a half-second later, in horror, she clarified, "I mean, is anyone sitting here? I mean, clearly you're sitting there, I meant, is the seat taken?" She gestured at the empty stool between them that neither of them was occupying. It was already the most embarrassing sentence she had ever said in a professional context. He did not laugh. He did not do any of the things she had braced for. He looked at her for one long, measuring second, and something moved through the absolute darkness of his eyes, something that was not quite amusement and not quite recognition but occupied the precise emotional territory between them. "It's yours," he said. His voice was low, and it carried in a way that had nothing to do with volume and everything to do with frequency, the way a cello note carries across a concert hall without effort. "Everything at this bar is yours, if you want it." She had no idea what that meant. She moved to the middle stool. She did not know yet that she was sitting next to the men who owned the building, the restaurant, the firm that owned the restaurant, and a significant percentage of everything else in a 40-block radius. She did not know that the name she was about to spend her evening professionally preparing to defend in a tax tribunal was his name. She did not know that 3 private security operatives had repositioned themselves within the restaurant the moment she sat down, not because of her, she thought, but because of him, which was true. She did not know any of the things that were about to become rapidly, catastrophically, and irreversibly known to her. His name was Solomon Dade. He ordered her a drink without asking, which should have irritated her, and did, and also did not, because it was exactly what she wanted, which was either evidence of extraordinary perceptiveness or something considerably more alarming. "You look like you've been waiting for someone unreliable," he said. He did not make it a question. "I look like that," she said. "What does that look like?" "Like someone who is used to waiting," he said, "and is too disciplined to be visibly impatient, but whose left hand keeps moving toward her phone and then stopping." She looked at her left hand. She had not noticed it doing that. "That's an uncomfortable amount of observation for a stranger," she said. "I'm not generally in the habit of being comfortable," he replied. He said it the way other people said their own name, as a simple statement of fact, without apology or performance. She should have found this alarming. She found it, to her considerable consternation, deeply interesting. They talked for 22 minutes before her contact finally appeared, a frantic junior associate named Marcus who arrived sweating and apologetic and handed her a folder thick with financial records before fleeing back into the night. She looked at the folder. She looked at the name printed on the tab. Solomon Dade Holdings. She looked back at Solomon Dade. He was watching her with an expression of absolute, contained stillness, and in the dark depths of his eyes there was something that looked, impossibly, like it had been waiting for exactly this moment. "This is yours," she said. It was not a question. "I needed to know," he said quietly, "what kind of attorney you were before I let you near it." She should have been furious. She was, technically, furious. She was also aware, somewhere beneath the fury, that she was intrigued in a way she had not been intrigued by anything in years, and that the folder in her hands contained financial structures that her mind was already, involuntarily, beginning to map. She opened it. She spent 4 minutes reading it in silence. He waited. He was exceptionally good at waiting, with the patient, coiled stillness of something that had learned long ago that rushing was a luxury of men who had something to prove. Your holding structure in the Cayman routing is going to attract secondary audit flags, she said, not looking up. Your forensic accountant buried the transfer fees wrong. They minimized them to avoid attention and instead made them look deliberate, which is worse. A pause. My forensic accountant has a degree from Wharton, he said. So does the IRS agent who's going to flag it, she replied. She looked up. He was looking at her with an expression she could not categorize, one she would spend a considerable amount of time in the following weeks attempting to categorize, and ultimately conclude was the look of a man who had spent a very long time in rooms full of people who were afraid of him, and who had just encountered someone who was not, and who did not know what to do with the specific, unfamiliar warmth that produced in his chest. He asked for her card before she left. She gave it to him. She told herself it was because he was a client, which was true, and told herself that was the only reason, which was not. She walked out of Aurelius and into the cold night air and stood on the sidewalk for a moment, breathing, with the sensation that she had just been in the presence of something that rearranged the air around it, and that the air had not yet fully rearranged itself back. She did not know that he watched her leave. She did not know that he watched her the way a man watches something he is not yet certain he is allowed to want, which is to say with the complete and total attention of someone who has already, privately, decided. She did not know that 30 seconds after she disappeared around the corner, one of his security team, a man named Rourke, materialized at his elbow and said, quietly, background. And that he sat with the question for 3 full seconds before he said, very quietly, no, which was the first time in 11 years of operating at the level he operated at that he had declined that particular offer. She did not know any of this. She went home and spent 4 hours reading the financial brief and found 7 additional structural vulnerabilities before she went to sleep, and when she woke up she felt, inexplicably and irritatingly, as if she were looking forward to something. The meeting the following morning was held in a conference room on the 38th floor of a building that bore no external signage, which Nadia took as either a sign of supreme confidence or supreme paranoia and concluded was probably both. She arrived 12 minutes early, which was her habit. She was the first one there, which she had expected. She was not the first one there. Solomon Dade was already seated at the far end of the table, reading a document, and he looked up when she entered with the same quality of complete attention he had applied to her in the bar, as if he had a finite and very precise amount of focus and had chosen to place all of it on her. With him were 2 attorneys, a financial advisor, and a woman named Constance who appeared to function as a combination chief of staff and human shield, intercepting questions before they reached him, answering on his behalf, filtering the room. There were also, Nadia noted, 2 men standing near the windows who were not attorneys and were not financial advisors and were positioned in the specific way that people are positioned when their primary professional function is the prevention of harm. She sat down. She opened her briefcase. She placed her findings on the table in a neat, precise stack. She had rewritten her notes 3 times the night before, not because her analysis needed refinement, it never did, but because she had been, to her considerable annoyance, distracted in a way she wasn't used to being distracted. She was not distracted now. She was at work, and at work Nadia Okafor was the most focused organism in any given room. She presented her findings. She was not deferential. She did not soften the vulnerabilities to protect anyone's ego. She identified the problems with surgical precision, outlined the remediation strategy with equal precision, and finished within the allotted time without wasting a single word. The 2 attorneys looked at each other. The financial advisor made a note and then looked at the note as if reconsidering it. Constance, who appeared to be constitutionally incapable of expressing surprise, expressed something in the region of surprise. Solomon Dade said nothing. He watched her the way she had noticed he watched everything, with the total, quiet, absolute attention of someone who was not performing interest but simply experiencing it, and she thought, not for the first time and not for the last, that being the object of that quality of attention was the most unsettling and the most oddly compelling thing that had happened to her in a very long time. After the meeting, as she was gathering her materials, Constance approached her and placed a cream-colored envelope on the table beside her briefcase. Nadia looked at it. Mr. Dade's personal invitation, Constance said, and then walked away without elaborating, which Nadia suspected was a practiced technique for preventing questions. She opened it. Inside was a card, heavy stock, with 5 handwritten words and a time. "Come have dinner with me." She stood holding it for a moment in the empty conference room. She put it in her briefcase. She told herself she was going to think about it. She had already decided. Dinner was at a place that had no menu, where the food arrived in courses determined by someone in the kitchen who appeared to know things about her preferences that she had not communicated to anyone. She noted this, filed it away, and said, "How did they know I don't eat shellfish?" He looked at her over his wine glass with that same quality of contained observation. "I pay attention," he said. "You mentioned it last night." When the bartender recited the specials, she had not realized she had said it loudly enough to be heard. She had not realized she had said it to anyone. "That's a very particular kind of attention," she said. "I have a particular interest in the source material," he replied. She thought about letting that pass. She did not let it pass. "I'm not source material," she said. "I didn't mean it that way," he said, and for the first time she saw a faint, controlled trace of something that might have been discomfort cross his face, the discomfort of a man who had said the wrong thing and knew it and was not accustomed to caring. "I meant that I find you interesting. I meant it as the most direct compliment I know how to give, which apparently isn't very direct." He set his wine glass down. "I am better at most things than I am at this." She looked at him. "What is this?" "Wanting someone to stay," he said, very quietly, and the simplicity of it sat between them like something physical, and she did not say anything for a moment because there was nothing to say that wouldn't diminish it. They stayed for 3 hours. She ordered dessert. She ordered it without the specific internal negotiation she usually performed before eating in front of a man, the calculation of what it would communicate, the preemptive armor against a reaction that never actually came from him, because he watched her eat with the same frank appreciation he appeared to apply to everything else about her, without comment, without qualification, as if the only thing worth noting was that she was enjoying it. She did not realize, at the time, how much that cost her nothing. She did not realize, at the time, how long it had been since something had cost her nothing. He walked her to her car. He did not try to come upstairs. He stood on the sidewalk in his charcoal suit in the cold and looked at her and said, "Tomorrow, not a question." She said, "I have a 7 o'clock, he said, "I know." Before that, she went upstairs. She stood in her apartment and felt, again, that charged atmospheric quality, as if the air had not caught up with what had just happened. She was still feeling it when her phone lit up with a message, no name, just a number she did not have saved, 2 words. "Good night." She saved the number. She did not analyze why she saved it immediately rather than waiting until morning. She knew why. The 4th time she had dinner with him, the world came apart. It arrived not as an explosion but as a quiet disruption, the way the most significant things always arrive, not with noise but with a single sentence delivered in a moment of ordinary peace. They were at his apartment, which occupied the entire top floor of a building that looked, from the outside, like it belonged to a financial institution and felt, on the inside, like the home of someone who had spent a considerable amount of time and money creating a space that was both impenetrable and, against all probability, warm. She was sitting on a couch the color of midnight with a glass of wine and a brief she had been trying, unsuccessfully, to read for the past 40 minutes because she was not reading it. She was listening to him tell her about a shipping port dispute in a tone that made a shipping port dispute sound like something worth listening to, which was either a gift or a problem she had not yet fully accounted for. His phone buzzed. He looked at it. Something changed in his face, a very small, controlled change that she would not have caught if she had not, by this point, spent approximately 30 hours in close proximity to that face and learned its particular grammar. He set the phone face down. He picked it up again. He said, very quietly, and not looking at her, "I need to tell you something." She set down the brief. She said, "Okay." He was quiet for 3 seconds. In her experience, men who were quiet for 3 seconds before speaking were either about to say something true or something carefully constructed to resemble truth. She had learned to know the difference. He said, "Your father's name was Emeka Okafor." She felt the sentence land without entirely understanding it. "Is," she corrected. "Is." "He's in Lagos." "He's not in Lagos," Solomon said. He finally looked at her. The darkness in his eyes had shifted, replaced by something careful and heavy, the look of a man carrying weight he had been carrying for a while and had decided it was time to put down. "Your father's name was Emeka Okafor. He died 4 years ago. He was the founder and head of the Okafor Syndicate, which controlled trade routes between the west coast of Africa and 3 major European ports for 22 years. He was one of the most powerful and careful men I have ever encountered in my life. And he was the reason, he paused here, with the deliberateness of someone choosing each word like a step across uncertain ground, that I first heard your name. Before I ever walked into Aurelius, the room was very quiet. Nadia was aware of her own heartbeat in a way she was not usually aware of it. She was also aware of something happening in her mind, a rapid, involuntary pattern matching, the financial brief she had spent weeks analyzing, the routing structures that had seemed obscure in a way that felt almost architectural, as if someone had designed them to be obscure from a very specific angle, the angle of someone who knew what they were hiding, the names of the shell companies, one of which, she now realized, translated from Igbo as, "my daughter's house," she said. "How long have you known?" he said. "Long enough that I should have told you before now," she said. "How did you know and why didn't you tell me?" he said. "Because the first time I met you, I needed to know if you could handle what I was about to hand you. And then, after the first time I met you, I could not find a version of the conversation that did not feel like a betrayal, and I kept waiting for a better version, and there is no better version." She stood up. She walked to the window. The city spread below her in its organized grid of lights, each one a decision someone made, a building built, a deal completed, a world within a world hidden in plain sight underneath the ordinary visible surface, and she thought about her mother, who had told her that her father was a textile importer who died in a car accident when Nadia was 3, and who had told her this in the specific, practiced way of someone who had rehearsed the sentence until it felt true, and who had never, in 29 years, told her anything else. She turned around. She said, "Tell me everything." He told her everything. It took the better part of 4 hours. It included information she had to stop him twice to verify against the financial records she had on her laptop, not because she doubted him, but because her mind operated in evidence and she needed the confirmation of the numbers before she could construct a true map of it. Her father had not died 4 years ago in the conventional sense. He had been killed, specifically and deliberately, by a man named Augustin Ferrer, a French syndicate head who had spent a decade attempting to access the African trade routes that Emeka Okafor controlled and had finally decided that the most efficient solution was not negotiation. Augustin Ferrer was currently alive. He was currently operating. And he was, as of approximately 18 months ago, aware that Emeka Okafor had a daughter, and aware of the general vicinity of that daughter's location, which was how Solomon Dade, whose organization had a complicated and long-standing intelligence-sharing arrangement with the Okafor syndicate's remaining lieutenants, had been asked to quietly determine whether she was, in fact, the Nadia Okafor in question, and quietly ensure her continued safety, and who had arrived at Aurelius with the intention of conducting a professional assessment and had instead sat down beside a woman in a corner seat who was clearly not eating anything because she did not want anyone to look at her, and had felt something inside his chest do something unfamiliar, and had completely departed from the plan. "The plan," she said, "was to assess me, yes, from a distance, that was the plan, and instead, he said, I introduced myself, and the subsequent dinners were what, exactly?" He looked at her steadily. "Not the plan," he said. "Not even close to the plan." She sat with this. She sat with the entirety of what she had just learned, the father she had never known, the world she had never been told she came from, the inheritance that was not financial but structural, a set of routes and relationships and carefully built and visible architecture that was now, apparently, hers, and also the man sitting across from her who had found her through obligation and stayed through something else entirely. She said, "What does Ferrer want?" Solomon said, "Everything your father built. He has been systematically acquiring the access points, the port contacts, the shipping documentation, everything except the master routing keys, which your father apparently encoded in a way that his own lieutenants cannot break. They believe he may have left the decryption with someone he trusted outside the organization." She looked at him. "With me," she said. "With you," he confirmed. She thought about this. She thought about the memory stick her mother had pressed into her hand at 21, the one she had kept in a fireproof box in her apartment for 8 years because her mother had said it was important documents, tax records, keep it safe. And she had been a tax attorney in training and the instruction had made complete sense and she had never questioned it because she had had no reason to question it and also because that was the kind of woman she was, methodical, trusting of the logic of systems. She said, "I need to make a phone call," he said. "I know," he said, "I'll be here." She called her mother. It was 11:47 at night. Her mother answered on the second ring, which meant she had been waiting, which meant she had known this moment was approaching. The conversation was short. Her mother said, I hoped you'd have more time, Nadia said. How much of it is true? Her mother was quiet for a moment in the way of someone laying down a very heavy thing. Then she said, all of it. Then she said, the drive. You still have it? I still have it. Then you have everything he left you, her mother said. And you have enough, she said. Mama, her mother said, you are your father's daughter. You always were. Even when you didn't know it. After she hung up, she sat very still. Solomon was across the room, standing by the window, giving her the specific quality of space that a person gives when they have learned to read rooms, not physically distant but contained, not pressing. She looked at him. He looked back. She said, I need to go to my apartment, he said. I'll come with you, she said. I know you will, he said. Nadia, she said, I know. I know what it is. I know what you were supposed to do and what you did instead, and I am not finished being angry about the first part. She stood. But the second part, she said, we can talk about the second part later. He almost smiled. It was the closest she had seen his face come to something unguarded, a fractional, involuntary softening at the corners of his eyes. Later, he agreed. They went to her apartment. She retrieved the drive. She opened it. She had never opened it before. It was encrypted, with a password she had never known, and she sat in front of her laptop in her apartment at 12:30 in the morning, and Solomon Dade sat beside her, and she thought about her father, who she had never met, who had apparently known her in the way that people know things they cannot say out loud, and she typed the date of her birth, because it was the only thing she had, and the drive opened. What was inside was not sentimental. It was not a letter, not a photograph, not the personal artifacts of a man she had never known. It was a system. It was the most elegant, comprehensive financial routing architecture she had ever seen, routes and relationships and counterparty structures spanning 4 continents, built with the precision and care of someone who had understood that what he was building would outlast him, and who had wanted it to outlast him specifically in the hands of the person who could best understand it, which was his daughter, who had apparently inherited not just his name but his mind. She spent 3 hours reading it. Solomon sat beside her the entire time, occasionally leaning over to look at what she was reading, and she found, in a way that surprised her given the circumstances, that she did not mind him being there. That it felt, in fact, like a reasonable place for him to be. At 3:20 in the morning she looked up and said, Ferrer doesn't know what he's looking for. He thinks it's access credentials. These aren't access credentials. This is a map of leverage. Every relationship, every counterparty, every official who was ever paid for anything, documented and cross-referenced. Whoever holds this doesn't just have a trade route. They have the ability to dismantle or protect every organization that ever touched the network. She looked at Solomon. My father didn't leave me a business, she said. He left me a throne. Solomon was quiet for a moment. Then he said, yes, and Ferrer is not equipped for what comes next. Solomon said, now that you know what you're holding. She looked back at the screen. She looked at the shape of what her father had built, the invisible architecture of power, and she thought about the corner booth and the dark clothing and the 30 years of making herself small in spaces that did not ask for her, and she thought about the moment on the sidewalk outside Aurelius when she had breathed cold air and felt the world rearranging itself, and she understood, with the specific clarity of someone who processes the world in structures and patterns, that what it had been rearranging itself into was this. She said, I'm going to need a bigger office, he said. I own 3 buildings, she said. I know. I read your portfolio, he said. Of course you did. This time, she was the one who almost smiled. She looked at him, this man who had sat beside her all night, who had not flinched when she was angry, who had not retreated when she was difficult, who had watched her eat dessert without comment and walked her to her car without demanding something in return, who had a face built for intimidation and eyes that looked at her as if she were the only fixed point in a shifting room. I am still angry about the part where you didn't tell me, she said. I know, he said. And I will be for a while. I know, he said. Good, she said. She turned back to the screen. She began to work. He stayed. Augustine Ferrer sent a representative to the city 6 days later. The representative, a polished, soft-voiced man named Gillis, arrived at the offices of Holloway and Associates and asked for a meeting, which Nadia agreed to because she had spent the preceding 6 days reading everything in her father's drive and she understood, now, the complete architecture of what Ferrer had been attempting to build and exactly where its foundation was weak. She met with Gillis in the large conference room on the 14th floor, not the 38th floor, not Solomon's building, not anywhere that carried the weight of what she now knew, just a standard glass-walled conference room that said attorney and said boring and said nothing that she actually was. She listened to Gillis for 18 minutes. He was well prepared and smoothly delivered and said nothing true. He was attempting to negotiate access to what he called her father's legacy on behalf of a consortium of European investors, which was a description of Ferrer's operation in the same way that describing a shark as a large fish was technically accurate and practically useless. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. She said, "The secondary routing through the Marseille's clearinghouse. The one that Ferrer's organization set up 8 years ago to try to replicate the West Coast access." Gillis's expression shifted, very slightly, in a way that confirmed everything. "I have the documentation," she said. "All of it. The original transfer authorizations, the counterparty agreements, the names of every official involved. I also have the master keys to the original network, which means that every legitimate shipper my father worked with for 20 years is currently routing through a system that I control." She leaned forward. She had learned how to take up space. She had learned this recently and it fit her more naturally than she would have expected. "You are going to go back to Ferrer," she said, "and you are going to tell him that the Okafor network is no longer available to him. Not now, not in a restructured form, not through any intermediary. You are also going to tell him that I have prepared a complete documentation package and lodged it with 3 separate parties who will release it in the event that anything happens to me, to my mother, or to anyone in my current professional or personal circle. Attempting to acquire this network by force will be the most expensive mistake he has ever made, and based on what I've read about his operating history, that is a genuinely high bar." Gillis sat for a moment. He said, "You understand that Mr. Ferrer is not a man who responds well to Gillis," she said. "Look at me." He looked at her. She was wearing a deep burgundy blazer over an ivory blouse, her natural hair pulled back into a crown that she had decided, recently, was exactly the right word for it. She was the largest person in the room by a considerable margin and she sat in her chair like she had been placed there by the same hand that placed thrones. "I am my father's daughter," she said. "Tell him." After Gillis left, she sat alone in the conference room for a few minutes and let the adrenaline settle. Then she took out her phone and sent a single message to a number she had saved 3 weeks ago with the label she had chosen because it was accurate and because it made her smile. The message was 2 words. "It's done." The reply came in 40 seconds. "Dinner," she typed back, "you're cooking." A pause. "I own 6 restaurants." "That's not the same thing," she wrote. Another pause, longer. Then, "I'll learn." She put her phone in her pocket. She gathered her things. She walked out of the conference room and down the hall toward the elevator and she did not hug the wall and she did not choose the corner and she did not make herself smaller than she was, because she was Nadia Okafor and she was her father's daughter and she was done, permanently and without exception, taking up less space than she deserved. The elevator doors opened. She stepped in. She pressed the button for the lobby. She was going to be late for nothing. She had never once in her life been going anywhere she actually wanted to be at the time she wanted to be there, which meant, she thought, as the elevator descended and the city waited below her, that everything in her life up until right now had simply been the before part. She stepped out into the lobby. She walked through the doors and into the light. She was not afraid of being seen. She was finished being anything else. She had been in the city for 29 years and had never once walked through its center at noon without calculating the width of the sidewalk versus the width of her body versus the likelihood of someone making a comment. She had done this calculation so many times it had become automatic, the way breathing was automatic, the way flinching was automatic when you had spent long enough practicing it. The first day she did not do this calculation was a Thursday in early November, 6 weeks after the night in Aurelius, 4 weeks after she had opened her father's drive, 2 weeks after Gillis had gone back to Ferrer with her message and Ferrer had, according to Solomon's intelligence, responded with a silence that meant he was deciding, which was the best possible response because it meant he was weighing the cost and the cost was real. She walked through the center of the city at noon on a Thursday and she took up the space she took up and she did not calculate anything and it was not, she discovered, a dramatic experience. It did not feel like a triumph. It felt like breathing normally after a very long time of breathing wrong. Small and enormous in the same breath. She bought coffee from a cart on a corner she had passed every working day for 4 years and had never stopped at because stopping meant standing still and standing still meant being visible and being visible had always felt like an invitation to something she did not want to accept. The man at the cart was named, according to his name tag, Darius. Darius handed her the coffee and said, "Haven't seen you before," she said. "I come past every day," he said, must have missed you, she said. Most people do, she walked on. She drank the coffee. It was exactly what she needed and she had not asked for it to be anything else. She thought, for no particular reason, about the woman she had been sitting in that corner booth 4 months ago, the one who had spent 11 hours waiting to be invisible again, who had developed a system that was not a life but was a very functional imitation of one. She did not feel sorry for that woman. She felt something more like recognition, the specific tenderness of seeing something clearly that you have been too close to see clearly before. That woman had kept herself alive through an extraordinary act of sustained discipline, and the discipline had cost her things she was only now beginning to inventory. She was going to take her time with the inventory. She was, for the first time in a very long time, in no hurry. Solomon called it too. He did this most days, not because he needed anything, which she had initially found suspicious and then had recognized as something else, the habit of a man who had spent a long time at the center of a system where every communication was transactional and who was currently, somewhat awkwardly, learning what it meant to want contact for its own sake. The Ferrer situation, he said. His legal team made contact with the Geneva-based arm of your father's network this morning. They want a meeting. What kind of meeting? She said. Capitulation dressed as negotiation, he said. She thought about this. Tell them yes, she said. Tell them the meeting is here. My office, my terms. I'll draw up the parameters this afternoon. A pause. You could let my team handle the parameters, he said. I know, she said. I'm going to draw them up. Another pause, this one with a different quality, a pause that contained something she had started to recognize as the sound of him smiling without making any sound. Okay, he said. Send me a copy when you're done. I'll send you a copy when it's finalized, she said. In case I want changes, he said. In case I consider your changes, she replied. She could hear him almost smiling again. She hung up and went back to work and drew up the parameters, and they were exactly right, and she knew they were exactly right not because she was arrogant but because she understood the material completely, because the drive her father had left her had contained not just a network but an education, a complete and meticulous record of how her father thought, how he built, how he protected, how he made himself so essential to so many different systems that removing him required violence rather than persuasion, which was the highest form of leverage, and also, she was beginning to understand, an inheritance that came with obligations she was still mapping the full shape of. The meeting with Ferrer's representatives took place on a Monday morning. There were 4 of them. They were all men and they were all expensive, and they had all, she could see immediately, prepared for a version of her that did not exist anymore, possibly had never existed except in the corner booth in Aurelius, which was a lifetime and a different woman ago. They had prepared for someone who could be managed, which was what men like this prepared for when they were preparing for a woman, particularly a woman they had categorized before they walked in the room, and she could see the categorization happening as they looked at her, the quick inventory, the invisible recalibration of how hard this was going to be based on conclusions drawn from information that had nothing to do with the information that was relevant, and she let them finish the categorization and she let them settle into their seats and she said, Gentlemen, we are going to start with the secondary routing documentation because I want to be efficient with everyone's time, the lead attorney. A man named Christophe, who had a practiced look of permanent mild amusement that she suspected had served him well in rooms where people were uncertain of themselves, said, Ms. Okafor, perhaps we should begin with introductions. She looked at him. She said, I know who you are, Christophe. I know who retained you and I know what you were briefed to offer and I know what the actual floor of your negotiating range is because it's in the documentation, which I have read. We can do the introduction portion of the meeting or we can start from a position of mutual clarity. I recommend mutual clarity. Christophe's practiced amusement did not disappear but it shifted, acquiring a layer beneath it that was not amusement, that was the look of a man recalculating the terrain. He said, by all means, Ms. Okafor. Proceed, she proceeded. It took 92 minutes. When it was finished, Ferrer's position was formally and legally removed from every access point in the network. The European routing was restructured under a holding company that she had spent the previous week constructing, and the documentation package was transferred from the 3 custodians she had lodged it with to a single secure archive under a legal framework that meant any attempt to access it without her authorization would trigger automatic regulatory notification across 4 jurisdictions. It was not the most elegant solution. It was the most durable one. Christophe shook her hand at the end with the specific quality of a man who has lost something he did not expect to lose to someone he did not expect to lose it to and is making a professional effort not to let this show, which was the most honest thing that had happened in the room all morning. After they left, Constance appeared in the doorway. Nadia had hired Constance 3 weeks ago, which had involved a brief and slightly surreal conversation with Solomon in which she had said she needed an operational coordinator and he had said he knew the best one he had ever worked with, and she had said she was not going to use his staff and he had said she would not be using his staff because Constance had been considering other opportunities for some time, and she had thought about this for 24 hours and then called Constance, and the conversation had lasted 4 minutes and they had understood each other completely, and that had been that. Constance said, "That went faster than projected." Nadia said, "They were prepared for a different meeting." Constance said, "They usually are." She said it with the flat certainty of someone who had been observing this particular dynamic for a considerable number of years. She then said, "Mr. Dade's office called. He would like to know the outcome." Nadia said, "Tell him it's handled." Constance said, "He will ask for more detail than that." Nadia said, "Tell him he can ask me himself at dinner." Constance said, "I'll relay that message exactly as stated." She left. Nadia sat alone in the conference room for a moment. The city moved outside the window, indifferent and enormous and ordinary, and she thought about her father, whom she would never meet, who had built something extraordinary in complete silence and left it to her in the most careful way he knew how, through a memory stick in her mother's hands and the faith that she would eventually arrive at the moment when she was ready to open it. She thought that she would have liked him. She thought he would have liked her. She thought they probably would have disagreed about methods and agreed about principles, and that this was the best possible version of a family dynamic she could imagine for herself. She picked up her phone. She typed a message to her mother. It said, "It's done." He would have been pleased. 3 minutes later her mother replied with 2 words and a photograph. The words were, "He was." The photograph was of a man she did not recognize and recognized completely, broad and dark and large with eyes that in the photograph looked as if they were paying complete attention to something just outside the frame, and she sat with the photograph for a long time, and she did not cry, or she cried a little, and both were fine, because she was her father's daughter and her father had built a world in which being fine meant being precisely and completely what you were, no more, no less, without apology and without the ongoing, exhausting work of making yourself something smaller than the space you actually occupied. She put her phone in her pocket. She stood up. Constance appeared in the doorway with her coat and her briefcase. The city was outside, waiting. She went to dinner.